The year was 2247. Earth had long since joined the intergalactic community, becoming a small yet significant player within the sprawling alliance known as the Galactic Concordium. This federation united hundreds of species across the cosmos, each bringing its own unique strengths, weaknesses, and philosophies to the table. Among them were the Ceravans, an enigmatic race revered for their crystalline cities, psychic abilities, and their rigid code of honor. The Ceravans, though advanced in intellect and power, were known for their uncompromising laws. Any deviation from their strict societal norms was met with punishment so severe that most did not dare to rebel. However, not everyone could live under such suffocating rigidity. Rhea, a young Ceravan woman with striking silver hair and eyes like violet flames, was one such soul. From an early age, Rhea had been curious about the universe beyond her homeworld, Syraxis, a place of shimmering spires and floating gardens where life was an unbroken symphony of discipline and tradition. Her mind was restless, her heart yearning for the untamed. She had devoured stories of other worlds, particularly Earth, where chaos and beauty seemed to dance hand in hand. This curiosity became her undoing. One forbidden night, Rhea used her psychic powers to bypass Ceravan encryption and access restricted archives. Her aim was to study Earth's cultures, its music, art, and unpredictable people. The act was considered treasonous, a contamination of the pure mind that Ceravans prided themselves on. When her transgression was uncovered, Rhea was dragged before the Council of Elders, a towering tribunal of luminous beings who ruled with an iron grip. The council chamber was a cathedral of light, where the crystalline walls seemed to hum with judgment. Rhea stood alone, her head held high despite the chains of energy that bound her hands. Before her sat the elders, their eyes glowing with an ethereal light that seemed to pierce through her very soul. Rhea of House Sierra, the head elder intoned, his voice echoing through the chamber like the chime of a great bell. You stand accused of defiling the sanctity of the Ceravan mind. You have consumed the forbidden knowledge of an inferior species. Do you deny your crimes? I do not, Rhea replied, her voice steady but defiant. But I do not regret them. How can we claim to be the protectors of wisdom if we fear understanding others? The humans are not inferior. They are different. A ripple of shock ran through the assembled council members. No Ceravan had ever dared to speak such words in the chamber. The head elder's glowing eyes narrowed, his tone turning cold. Your arrogance is a blight upon your house. You have defied the very essence of what it means to be Ceravan. For this, you must be punished. Rhea expected exile, perhaps imprisonment, but the sentence that followed was beyond her imagination. You will be stripped of your status, your powers suppressed, and sent to Earth, not as a visitor, but as a servant. You will be bound to a human, a living example of the price of defiance. You will serve until you have learned the humility and obedience that you lack. The chamber fell silent, save for the faint hum of energy chains. Rhea's heart pounded. A servant. To a human, it was a fate worse than exile, worse even than death. She was given no time to protest. The council's decision was final. The journey to Earth was a blur. Rhea was fitted with a collar-like device that nullified her psychic abilities, leaving her powerless for the first time in her life. She was placed into stasis for the voyage, her mind trapped in a cold void as her body was ferried across the stars. When she awoke, the harsh sunlight of an alien world greeted her. She was no longer in the crystalline halls of Syraxis, but in a dusty yard bordered by sparse fields and a squat farmhouse. The landscape was raw and rugged, a stark contrast to the polished perfection of her homeworld. Standing before her was the human man to whom she had been given, Mark Evers. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with tousled brown hair and a wiry frame. His skin was sun-kissed, and his eyes betrayed a mix of surprise and uncertainty as they met hers. Rhea stepped out of the stasis pod, her movements graceful despite the weight of the suppressor around her neck. She straightened her posture, refusing to let the indignity of her situation rob her of her pride. "I am Rhea," she said, her voice cool and detached. "I have been sent here to serve as your slave." The word hung in the air, heavy and bitter. Mark frowned, his brows knitting together. "Slave," he echoed, the distaste evident in his voice. "I don't know what kind of messed-up arrangement this is, but I'm not keeping you as a slave. That's not how I do things." Rhea's violet eyes narrowed. "You would defy your own people. The Seravan Council has ensured I cannot leave. I am bound to this place, and it seems, to you." Mark rubbed the back of his neck, glancing at the stasis pod, as if hoping for some manual to fall out and explain the situation. "Well, I didn't ask for this. But if you're stuck here, you're not going to be treated like some servant. You're free to do whatever you want, within reason. Let's figure this out together." Rhea blinked, taken aback. She had expected hostility, indifference, or exploitation, but not this. His kindness unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a reluctant nod, she replied, "Very well." Mark gave her a small, lopsided smile. "Good. Let's get you settled in. We'll figure out the rest later." As she followed him into the modest farmhouse, Rhea couldn't help but feel the weight of her predicament. She was in a strange new world, bound to a man she knew nothing about. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of a story neither of them could have foreseen. The days following Rhea's arrival on Earth were tense yet oddly intriguing. The stark simplicity of Mark's farmhouse stood in sharp contrast to the grandiose splendor of Syraxis. The walls were made of wood, the floors creaked with every step, and the air was filled with the faint aroma of soil and machinery. For Rhea, this world was raw, alive, and unnervingly unpredictable. Rhea spent the first few days silently observing her surroundings. Mark, true to his word, did not force her to perform any tasks. Instead, he gave her space, treating her as a guest rather than a subordinate. Despite his kindness, Rhea's pride burned with resentment. Her every glance at the suppressor collar around her neck reminded her of the humiliation imposed by the Seravan Council. Mark, for his part, struggled to adjust to the presence of an alien woman in his home. He was an engineer by trade, accustomed to working alone on his farm, maintaining the outdated equipment that kept his crops alive in the colony's harsh environment. Rhea's sudden arrival disrupted his quiet routine, but he couldn't bring himself to treat her as anything less than an equal. One evening, as the orange hues of the setting sun bathed the fields, Mark found Rhea standing by the fence, her silver hair shimmering in the light. She was staring at the horizon, her expression unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, leaning on the post beside her. Rhea didn't look at him. "This planet is different. Everything here feels so chaotic, so untamed. I don't understand how your people live like this." Mark chuckled softly. "That's kind of the charm. Chaos can be beautiful. It's what makes life unpredictable and worth living." Rhea frowned, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "On Syraxis, everything is controlled, perfect. There is no chaos, no uncertainty. It is safe. And yet you broke their rules to learn about us," Mark said, his tone gentle but curious. "Why?" For a moment, Rhea didn't respond. Then, with a hint of vulnerability in her voice, she replied, "Because I was tired of perfection. I wanted to understand what it meant to live, not just exist." Mark nodded, his respect for her growing. "Well, you've got plenty of that here. Life on this farm isn't easy, but it's real." As the days turned into weeks, Rhea's curiosity about Earth began to outweigh her resentment. She started asking questions about the machines Mark worked on, the crops he grew, and the way humans managed to thrive in such a harsh environment. Mark, eager to share, took her on a tour of the farm, explaining everything from the irrigation system to the solar panels that powered the house. One afternoon, Rhea surprised Mark by offering to help repair a malfunctioning water pump. Though her psychic abilities were suppressed, her sharp mind and quick learning made her a valuable assistant. Together, they worked in the sweltering sun, their hands coated in grease as they disassembled and rebuilt the machine. "You've got a knack for this," Mark said, wiping sweat from his brow. Rhea allowed herself a small smile, the first he had seen. Ceravans are taught to excel in all they do, even menial tasks. "Well, I wouldn't call this menial," Mark said, gesturing to the now functional pump. "Without this, the crops would die, and so would I. You just helped save my livelihood." Rhea's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. For the first time, she began to see the value in Earth's chaotic, hands-on way of life. It was messy, unpredictable, but it had purpose. As they worked together, an unspoken understanding began to form between them. Mark admired Rhea's intelligence and resilience, while Rhea found herself drawn to his quiet strength and unyielding kindness. Their conversations grew longer, ranging from philosophical debates to light-hearted banter. One evening, as they shared a modest meal of roasted vegetables and bread, Mark asked, "What's the one thing you miss most about Syraxis?" Rhea hesitated, then replied, "The gardens. They float in the air, shimmering with colors that change with the light. They are serene." Mark smiled. "Sounds beautiful. Maybe one day you can show me." Rhea's expression softened. "Perhaps. But for now, I am here, bound to this world and to you." Mark's smile faded, replaced by a solemn look. "I didn't ask for this, Rhea. But I promise, as long as you're here, I'll do my best to make it bearable." Rhea met his gaze, her violet eyes searching his. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile thread connecting two souls from vastly different worlds. The next day, Rhea woke early and found herself wandering the farm. She passed the fields, the old barn, and the small garden Mark had planted. She stopped at the workshop, where the tools and machines that kept the farm running were neatly arranged. A thought struck her. Perhaps she could do more than simply exist here. Perhaps she could contribute, not as a slave, but as an equal. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since her sentence, she felt a spark of purpose. By the time Mark came out to start his day, he found Rhea in the workshop, already tinkering with a broken generator. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't question it. Instead, he grabbed his tools and joined her. Together, they worked side by side, two beings from different worlds finding common ground in the simple act of creation. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Mark and Rhea stood by the fence once more. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that, despite their differences, they were no longer alone. And in the quiet of the night, a fragile truce began to bloom into something far more profound. The weeks passed, and the awkward cohabitation between Mark and Rhea began to transform into something neither of them had expected. Initially, Rhea had been determined to keep her distance, maintaining the cold aloofness that the Seravan culture had instilled in her. Mark, for his part, treated her presence with a mix of caution and respect, unsure of how to bridge the chasm between their worlds. But the farm had a way of softening barriers. One morning, Rhea stepped out into the crisp air to find Mark working on a section of the fence that had been damaged by a recent storm. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the fields. She hesitated for a moment before approaching him. He looked up, his face streaked with dirt, and gave her a lopsided smile. "Fence needs fixing," he said simply, gesturing to the tools. "Could use an extra pair of hands if you're up for it." Rhea studied him, her pride bristling at the idea of manual labor. But something about the way he asked, without expectation or demand, made her nod. She knelt beside him, and together they worked in silence, the rhythmic clink of tools filling the air. As they toiled, Rhea began to notice the way Mark's hands moved. Confident, deliberate, and efficient, there was an art to his work, a quiet determination that reminded her of the discipline she had once admired in her own people. Later that day, as they shared a meal of bread and stew, Rhea surprised herself by asking Mark a question. "Why do you live out here alone? You seem capable enough to be part of a larger community." Mark looked up from his plate, his brow furrowing in thought. "I guess I'd always liked the quiet. Out here, I can work on my own terms. No one telling me what to do or how to do it. It's not for everyone, but it suits me." Rhea nodded slowly, her thoughts turning inward. The Saravan world had been the opposite. Every action dictated by the council, every moment carefully choreographed. She had once yearned for freedom, but now that she had it, she found herself grappling with its weight. As days turned into weeks, Rhea began to take on more responsibilities around the farm. At first, it was small things, helping with repairs, organizing tools, and preparing simple meals. But over time, she became more involved, her natural intelligence and quick learning making her an invaluable partner. Mark noticed the change and quietly encouraged it, offering guidance without imposing. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Mark spoke up. "You're a quick learner, faster than anyone I've worked with before." Rhea glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Saravans are trained to excel in all things. It is our way." Mark nodded, taking a sip from his mug. "Still, you didn't have to help. But you did. I appreciate that." Rhea was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, she said, "Perhaps I wish to prove to myself that I am more than what the council decreed me to be." Mark smiled softly. "Well, for what it's worth, you're doing a damn good job." The quiet compliment warmed something in Rhea's chest, though she didn't fully understand why. She had always been driven by a need to prove herself, but this was different. It wasn't about defying the council or asserting her independence. It was about building something together. As their bond deepened, Rhea began to share stories of her home world. She spoke of the floating gardens, the crystalline cities, and the strict hierarchies that governed every aspect of Saravan life. Mark listened intently, his curiosity unguarded. In return, he shared tales of Earth's history, its triumphs and failures, its diversity and resilience. Rhea found herself drawn to his perspective, his unshakable belief in the potential of humanity. One night, as they worked late into the evening repairing an old generator, Rhea paused to look at Mark. "You are different from what I expected of humans." Mark raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "Better or worse?" Rhea considered the question carefully. "Better and worse. Your kind is unpredictable, reckless. But there is a strength in that recklessness, a resilience." Mark chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'll take that as a compliment." The moment hung between them, a fragile connection forged in shared labor and mutual respect. For the first time since her exile, Rhea felt a sense of belonging, a tentative but undeniable bond that defied the barriers of species and circumstance. The next day, Mark woke to find Rhea in the workshop, her silver hair glinting in the morning light as she carefully disassembled a piece of machinery. He watched her for a moment, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. She was no longer the cold, distant figure who had arrived weeks ago. She was becoming a part of his world. As the sun rose higher, casting its golden light across the fields, Mark stepped into the workshop and joined Rhea at the workbench. Together, they tackled the day's challenges, their partnership growing stronger with each passing moment. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were no longer just two individuals forced together by circumstance. They were a team, united by a shared determination to carve out a future in the chaos of their intertwined worlds. Life on the farm settled into an almost comfortable routine for Mark and Rhea, but the fragile peace they had built was soon disrupted. One afternoon, as they worked in the barn repairing an old drone used for crop maintenance, the distant hum of engines reached their ears. Mark straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, his brow furrowing in concern. "Visitors?" Rhea asked, her tone cautious. Not likely, Mark replied, his voice tense. Nobody comes out this far without a reason. They stepped outside, shielding their eyes from the harsh sunlight. On the horizon, two sleek ships approached, their designs far more advanced than anything Mark had ever seen. Rhea stiffened beside him, her sharp intake of breath betraying her unease. "Saravan enforcers," she whispered. Mark's stomach tightened. What do they want? Rhea's violet eyes were fixed on the ships as they descended, their engines kicking up clouds of dust. "To ensure I am fulfilling my punishment, or to deliver further consequences." The ships landed with a hiss of hydraulics, and a group of Saravan enforcers emerged. Clad in shimmering armor that caught the light, they moved with the precise grace of predators. At their head was a tall figure whose bearing radiated authority. His gaze swept over Mark and Rhea, cold and assessing. "Rhea of House Vala," the leader intoned, his voice sharp and commanding. "You have been summoned to account for your progress, or lack thereof." Mark stepped forward instinctively, his protective instincts kicking in. "She's been doing fine here. No need for whatever this is." The enforcer's gaze shifted to Mark, his expression unreadable. "Your opinion is irrelevant, human. This is Saravan law." Rhea raised a hand, silencing Mark before he could argue further. "What do you wish to see?" The enforcer's eyes narrowed. "Proof of your humility. Evidence that you have embraced your subjugation." Mark bristled at the words, but Rhea remained composed, her voice calm but firm. "I have served here, as decreed. I have learned to adapt to human ways and contribute to their labor." The enforcer's gaze flicked to the farmhouse, the fields and the barn, his expression skeptical. "We shall see." For the next hour, the Saravans inspected every inch of the property. They questioned Rhea about her duties, her interactions with Mark, and her understanding of human culture. Rhea answered with measured precision, her tone steady despite the disdain in their voices. Mark watched helplessly, anger simmering just beneath the surface. These enforcers spoke of humility, yet they carried themselves with an arrogance that made his blood boil. He wanted to defend Rhea, to tell them how much she had contributed, but he knew his words would carry no weight. Finally, the inspection concluded, and the leader turned to Rhea with a sneer. "You have made progress, but it is insufficient. The council will expect more from you when we return." Mark couldn't hold his tongue any longer. "She's done more than enough. You can't just show up and threaten her like this." The enforcer's eyes glinted with cold amusement. "And what would you do, human? Defy the will of the council?" Mark stepped closer, his jaw tight. "I'd do whatever it takes to protect her." The word hung in the air, and even Rhea looked at him with surprise. The enforcer's gaze darkened, but he said nothing, merely turning back to his ship. "This is not over," he said as he boarded. "We will return." The ships lifted off, their engines roaring as they disappeared into the sky. Mark and Rhea stood in silence, the dust settling around them. "You didn't have to do that," Rhea said softly, her voice filled with something Mark couldn't quite place. "Yes, I did," he replied. "You don't deserve to be treated like that." Rhea looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing, then turned and walked back toward the farmhouse. That night, as they sat together in the dimly lit kitchen, Mark broke the silence. "What happens if they decide you haven't done enough?" Rhea's gaze was distant, her voice low. "The council may revoke their leniency. They could order my execution, or worse, return me to Saravan for reconditioning." Mark clenched his fists, the thought filling him with dread. "That's not going to happen. We'll figure something out." Rhea looked at him, her eyes softening. "Why do you care so much, Mark? I was sent here as your punishment, not your responsibility." Mark hesitated, then met her gaze. "Maybe because I've seen who you really are. You're not the person they think you are. You're better. And I'm not going to let them take that away from you." Rhea's breath caught, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name stirring in her chest. She looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." As the night deepened, they sat together in silence, a fragile understanding forming between them. The Saravan enforcers had brought a threat that neither of them could ignore, but they had also brought clarity. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Days turned into weeks, and the tension from the Saravan enforcers' visit began to fade. However, the shadow of their return lingered, pushing both Mark and Rita to an unspoken determination. They worked side by side on the farm, falling into a rhythm that felt natural, even comforting. The boundaries of their unlikely partnership began to blur as they shared not just labor but stories, laughter, and moments of quiet understanding. Mark found himself fascinated by Ria's perspective on life. Despite the control the Saravan Council exerted over her people, she spoke with a deep curiosity and reverence for the beauty of the universe. Her descriptions of the crystalline Saravan cities and their floating gardens were captivating, and Mark could see her longing for the home she had lost. "You miss it, don't you?" he asked one evening as they sat under the stars. The air was cool, the silence punctuated by the chirping of crickets. Rhea glanced at him, her violet eyes reflecting the starlight. "I miss the idea of it. But the reality, it wasn't the paradise I once believed it to be." Mark nodded, sensing the conflict within her. "It's hard to let go of the places we come from, even if they're not perfect." "And what about you, Mark?" Rhea asked, tilting her head. "Do you ever miss the cities, the busy life?" He chuckled softly. "Not really. I came out here to escape all that. The noise, the chaos, it wasn't for me. I like the quiet, the simplicity. Out here, things make sense." Rhea smiled faintly. "And yet you took me in. The disruption to your peaceful life." Mark shrugged, his expression softening. "Sometimes the best things in life come from a little chaos." Their conversations grew deeper with each passing day. Rhea began to open up about her past, her rebellion against the council, and the harsh punishments she had endured. Mark listened intently, offering no judgment, only understanding. One afternoon, while tending to the crops, Rhea paused and looked toward the horizon. "You know," she began, "when I first arrived here, I thought this place was a prison. But now, it feels different." Mark straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Different how?" She hesitated, then met his gaze. "It feels like a new beginning. A chance to be something more than what the council dictated." Mark smiled, his chest tightening at her words. "That's what Earth does to people. Gives them a fresh start." As their bond deepened, so did their reliance on one another. Rhea's Saravan abilities, though suppressed, allowed her to notice subtle patterns and solutions that eluded Mark. She helped optimize the irrigation system, ensuring the crops thrived despite the dry climate. "Where did you learn all this?" Mark asked one day as they installed a new water filtration unit. "My people's technology is far more advanced than yours," she replied with a hint of pride. "Even with my abilities dampened, I can still think critically." "Well, I'm glad you're on my side," Mark said with a grin. Rhea tilted her head, studying him. "You really mean that, don't you? That you see me as an equal?" "Of course I do," Mark replied without hesitation. "Why wouldn't I?" Rhea didn't answer, but the warmth in her expression spoke volumes. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not as a Saravan rebel or a punished outcast, but as an individual. Their partnership extended beyond the farm. Mark began teaching Rhea more about human culture, from music to food to the peculiarities of Earth humor. Rhea, in turn, shared stories of Saravan myths and traditions, her voice weaving tales of gods and heroes that captivated Mark. One evening, as they sat by the fire pit sharing a meal, Rhea surprised Mark by laughing at one of his jokes. It was a soft, melodic sound that seemed to light up the night. "Did you just laugh?" Mark teased, his eyes twinkling. "I did," Rhea admitted, a hint of embarrassment in her tone. "Your humor is peculiar, but it has its charm." "Well, I'll take that as a compliment," Mark said, raising his glass in a mock toast. As the fire crackled between them, the unspoken bond they shared grew stronger. They were no longer just a human and a Seravan forced together by circumstance. They were becoming something more. But even as they built this connection, a sense of unease lingered. Rhea couldn't forget the Enforcer's warning, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their peace was fragile. The Seravan Council would return, and when they did, their bond would be tested in ways neither of them could foresee. For now, though, they allowed themselves to enjoy the moments of tranquility. Together, they found a sense of belonging neither had expected, and in the vast expanse of the universe, they discovered the beginnings of a love that transcended worlds. The peaceful rhythm of life on the farm was disrupted one crisp morning when Rhea felt a sudden, sharp sensation at the edges of her suppressed psychic abilities. Though muted by the Seravan device around her neck, it was unmistakable, a disturbance in the energy of the environment. She stopped mid-task, her hands frozen over the irrigation controls. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, noticing her distant expression. "I don't know," Rhea said cautiously, "but something feels off, like we're being watched." Mark frowned, scanning the horizon. The farm stretched out in all directions, the fields bordered by a sparse tree line. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Maybe it's just wildlife," he offered, though his tone betrayed his doubt. Rhea shook her head. "No, this is something else, something deliberate." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Mark double-checked the locks on the house. His unease mirrored Rhea's, though he tried to hide it. After all, he had promised her safety and freedom, both of which now felt precarious. Over dinner, they discussed the possibility of intruders. Rhea suspected the Seravan enforcers, while Mark considered the more mundane threat of local thieves or desperate colonists. "If it's the Council's enforcers," Rhea said, her voice low, "they won't stop at a simple warning this time. They'll want to assert their authority and punish us both." Mark's jaw tightened. If they think they can take you without a fight, they got another thing coming. Rhea looked at him, her eyes softening. "Mark, you don't understand what they're capable of. They're not like you. They won't hesitate to destroy everything in their path." "Then we'll be ready," Mark said firmly. "We've come too far to let them tear this apart." The next few days were spent fortifying the farm. Mark reinforced the perimeter fencing and rigged a series of simple alarms using spare parts from his workshop. Rhea, despite her dampened abilities, suggested strategic placements for the traps, drawing on her knowledge of Seravan tactics. Their preparations were put to the test sooner than they had anticipated. It was the dead of night when the alarms blared, jolting both Mark and Rhea awake. Mark grabbed a flashlight and his old hunting rifle, while Rhea followed closely, her senses on high alert. Outside, the night was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of Seravan technology. A sleek, black ship hovered just beyond the fields, its angular design unmistakably alien. "They're here," Rhea whispered, her voice trembling. Mark clenched his jaw, motioning for her to stay behind him. "Stay low. If things go south, head for the forest." "I'm not leaving you," Rhea said firmly. Before Mark could argue, a group of figures emerged from the ship, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. The Seravan enforcers were clad in shimmering, form-fitting armor that seemed to ripple with energy. The leader stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Rhea. "Rhea of the Seravan," he called out, his voice amplified by a device on his suit. "You have defied the Council's orders by fraternizing with this human. Surrender now, and your punishment will be swift." Mark stepped forward, his rifle aimed at the leader. "She's not going anywhere. You have no right to take her." The enforcer's eyes narrowed. "You dare to challenge the will of the Council, human. You are insignificant in the grand scheme of the galaxy." Mark's grip tightened on the rifle, but Rhea placed a hand on his arm. "Mark, wait. Let me talk to them." "Rhea, please," she said, her voice steady. "This is my fight." She stepped forward, her head held high despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I am no longer bound by the Council's rules," she declared. "I have found a life here, a life of choice, of freedom. You cannot take that from me." The enforcer sneered. "You speak of freedom, yet you are nothing without the Council. Do you truly believe this human can protect you?" "I don't need protection," Rhea said, her voice gaining strength. "What I need is for you to leave. This is my home now." The leader raised a hand, signaling his team. "Then you leave us no choice." Before they could act, Mark fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the fields, startling the enforcers. "Back off," he growled, "or the next one won't miss." The enforcers hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to resistance. Rhea seized the moment, stepping closer to Mark. "This is your final warning," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." For a tense moment, the night was silent. Then, to their surprise, the enforcer leader signaled his team to retreat. "This isn't over," he said coldly before boarding the ship. As the ship disappeared into the night sky, Mark exhaled deeply, lowering the rifle. Rhea turned to him, her expression a mix of relief and gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Mark smiled wryly. "Yes, I did. We're in this together, remember?" Rhea nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. Together, they returned to the house, knowing that the fight wasn't truly over, but for now, they had won a small victory. And in the quiet aftermath, they realized just how far they were willing to go to protect the life they had built together. The days following the confrontation with the Seravan enforcers were tense. Mark and Rhea worked tirelessly to repair the damage left in the wake of the encounter, both to the farm and their peace of mind. Despite the victory, the threat of the Council still loomed over them, a shadow that neither could ignore. But in the quiet moments, over meals, while working in the fields or under the starry night sky, they found solace in each other's company. The bond between them had grown deeper, forged in the fire of shared adversity. Rhea no longer saw herself as an outsider in this strange, untamed world. With Mark, she had found a place where she belonged, a life she had never thought possible. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the fields, Rhea turned to Mark. "I've been thinking," she began hesitantly. Mark glanced at her, a warm smile on his face. "That's usually a good sign." Rhea chuckled, shaking her head. "I'm serious. The enforcers will come back. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they won't stop until the Council's grip on me is secure again. And I won't let that happen." Mark's smile faded, replaced by a look of determination. "Then we'll be ready. Whatever it takes, Rhea, we'll face it together." "I don't want us to just survive," Rhea said, her voice firm. "I want us to thrive, to show them that their rules, their control, mean nothing here." Mark nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "What do you have in mind?" Over the next weeks, the two of them began laying the groundwork for a bold plan. With Rhea's deep understanding of Seravan technology and Mark's ingenuity, they developed a system to harness the natural energy of the planet to mask their presence. The device would create an electromagnetic shield, cloaking the farm and its inhabitants from Seravan scans. The work was grueling, and there were moments of doubt and frustration. But through it all, they supported each other, their shared goal driving them forward. On the day they activated the shield, a soft hum filled the air as the device came to life. Rhea and Mark stood side by side, watching as the farm seemed to shimmer briefly before settling into an undetectable quiet. "It's done," Rhea said, her voice filled with equal parts relief and pride. Mark grinned, pulling her into a hug. "We did it, together." The shield was a turning point. For the first time since Rhea's arrival, they felt truly safe. But more than that, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Rhea no longer felt like a fugitive or a prisoner. She was free, not just in body, but in spirit. Months turned into years, and the farm thrived. Mark and Rhea built a life together, one rooted in trust, respect, and love. They shared their knowledge with nearby settlers, helping the community grow stronger. Rhea's presence, once a source of suspicion and fear, became a beacon of hope and inspiration for those around her. In time, Rhea's story spread, reaching even the ears of the Saravan Council. But rather than sending more enforcers, the council chose to remain silent. Perhaps they recognized that Rhea's defiance had become something more than a single act of rebellion. It was a testament to the power of choice, the strength of individuality, and the unyielding spirit of humanity. One evening, as they stood together under the vast expanse of stars, Mark took Rhea's hand. "Do you ever think about what could have been, if you hadn't been sent here?" Rhea smiled, her violet eyes reflecting the starlight. "Sometimes, but then I remember that everything I've been through, every challenge, every loss, brought me here, to you, and I wouldn't change a thing." Mark squeezed her hand, his heart full. "Me neither." As they stood there, the future stretched out before them, filled with endless possibilities. Together, they had defied the odds, faced their fears, and built a life that was uniquely their own. And though their story had begun with punishment and pain, it had grown into something far greater, a testament to the power of resilience, love, and the courage to carve out one's own path.